I'm going to start my presentation with a little bit of a history of the publication I work for. If you are familiar with Grist, I apologize if any of this sounds familiar, but hopefully you'll still learn something new. And then I'm going to talk about the importance of climate reporting, our content strategy, and how, as a 25-year-old publication, on the climate beat, we tap into our journalism to ensure a financially sustainable business model. When I started reporting on climate change back in 2006, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was just 381 parts per million. I remember at the time the scientific community really terrified about the world crossing the dreaded 400 ppm threshold, right? The amount of warming that would be baked into the climate even if nations took that drastic action, if we hit 400 ppm. Today, we stand at 419 ppm. We have blown past that threshold. The global average temperature has increased 2.45 degrees Fahrenheit, or 1.36 degrees Celsius. I've tried to convert as much as I can in this presentation. Since before the Industrial Revolution, and Canada, as you all likely know, is warming twice as fast as the global average. The patterns, the warming is impacting communities around the globe. We have rainfall patterns that are changing, spurring devastating flooding in some areas and drought in others. The National Weather Service in the US has so far this year issued an unprecedented 91 flash flood emergencies. That's not warnings, that's emergencies. This is going to happen, get out now. There has never been a higher number since they even started with this term. Meanwhile, half of the United States is in drought. So you really see this sort of whiplash weather pattern that's happening. Ice at the poles and atop mountains are melting. Permafrost is thawing, making the towns and the roads and the other infrastructure built atop it unstable. And as the world's oceans heat up, they're expanding, driving sea level rise, as well as becoming more acidic and having an impact on things like corals and altering marine species. Extreme heat is now more frequent and lasts longer. Phoenix, Arizona experienced 113 days straight above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, or 38 degrees Celsius last year. 113. That broke the previous record of 2023. Last year in Canada, nearly 1 out of every 200 Canadians had to evacuate their homes because of wildfires. So when I started reporting this, I was reporting on what scientists were worried about, what their concerns were, and over my almost 20-year career, it is now happening. We are reporting on the impacts that they warned about. But with all this bad, there is also good, right? We know that the growing, albeit slow, response to climate change is sparking technological innovation, it's evolving industries, our energy mix, and our economies. Grist was founded in 1999 as an online media site. At the beginning, we were mostly a newsletter. I have a snippet here of a very early 2000s website of what Grist used to look like. We were dedicated to covering the environment. We started as a staff of 15. And also, shockingly, we were started as a nonprofit organization, which was an incredible outlier at the time. And I give our founder, Chip Giller, incredible foresight for establishing that sort of model. And over the next decade, we were a publication that worked to find its identity. Like most online sites in this period, we went through an irreverent blog phase. We tried writing with snark and humor. We published articles about baby animals to build our SEO. But nestled within all that identity searching, we also published just a lot of really thoughtful and deeply reported articles about the environment and the environmental movement. So in 2010, we helped launch an endeavor called the Climate Desk, which is a publishing relationship between several Mostly started with nonprofit news, but now is just across a wide variety of platforms in order to get climate coverage into as many different news outlets as possible. In 2016, we launched an annual list of the top 50 emerging environmental leaders to watch, particularly focused on environmentalists and environmental leaders of color. And in 2018, we served as the host organization. We helped co-found the Uproot Project, which is a professional organization for environmental journalists of color, which now has 700 members. In 2001, we solidified all of this change, all of this sort of identity focusing, and we launched with a new website and a new strategic focus. We leaned into our investigative and our in-depth reporting, and we produced high-impact journalism that changes policies, uncovers injustices, and drives the conversation around climate change. A question that I get a lot is, why are we called Grist? Grist, many people think of grist as, a grain or a grain for grinding, right? That's the widely understood term. But grist also means useful material, especially to back up an argument. And that is what Grist provides. We use the power of journalism to inform the public on the crisis of climate change so that they can make educated decisions about what to do about it. Grist has, in recent years, we've seen this shift and this editorial sort of re-strategization really pay off. We've won overall excellence honors from the National Magazine Awards, the Online News Association, and the Edward R. Murrow Awards, as well as dozens of other reporting and specific sort of project-specific honors. And that number is actually, I'm realizing, out of date. We now have more than 60 employees spread across more than 20 states in the US. We believe that climate change is one of the most existential threats we face, and that is impacting every person differently. And that belief drives the way we frame and present our coverage. We focus on the intersectionality of climate change. For the first 10 years of my reporting career, climate change was really siloed. It was considered just a science beat, right? You were on the science desk. The science desk was often one of the first ones to get cut if a newspaper or magazine was having budgetary woes. It was like, it's nice to have, but it's not critical to have. But as impacts have worsened, and it's begun altering people's lives in both subtle and dramatic ways, it became clear that this framing of climate change as sort of a siloed beat was not right. When you go to one of Grist's story pages, you do not see a single topic tag. This was a deliberate choice when we sort of rebranded. All of our stories are tagged Climate Plus. So these are just a few of the examples here. So Climate Plus culture, Climate Plus extreme weather, Climate Plus labor. The list goes on and on and on. And we don't have a staff of climate reporters. We have an Indigenous Affairs reporter, a Food and Ag reporter, a policy reporter, a health reporter, and all of those reporters cover their beats through a climate lens. We also aim to fill a critical gap in the climate conversation. When Grist first started publishing, just 30% of Americans, and forgive me for using Americans here, I wish I had Canadian numbers, but believed that climate change was happening, just 30%. Today, that number is up to 73%. But the latest polling shows that just 29% of adults surveyed believe that climate change is a social justice issue, and even less, just 19%, believe there is anything we can do about it. So, in response to all of our sort of strategy work that we've done in the last several years, we also beefed up our reporting on environmental justice and solutions work in order to address these critical gaps. The current Grist tagline, when you go to our website, says climate justice solutions. Those are the three main areas that we focus our work. So there are endless projects that I could point to that sort of demonstrate these priorities, but Here are 3 of my favorites. On the left here, we have a series that our climate and health reporter, Zoya Turstein, did about how warming temperatures are worsening the spread of infectious diseases globally. And we did that project in collaboration with the Associated Press. In the middle is a multi-year data-driven investigation on the lead pollution hidden within the soil of cities, a really long-lasting legacy of formal industrial activities that a lot of communities don't even know happened in their communities before it became residential. We published that project, which was a years-long investigation, with the local publication closest to where we focused our reporting, which was the Voice of OC, or Orange County, California, the local publication in Orange County, California. And on the right is a feature that we did on how, as communities and homeowners move towards this electrify everything movement. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with that, but it's essentially, electrify transportation, electrify home utilities, all of these things. That's all well and good, but we actually, in the US, do not have enough electricians. We do not have the trained workforce to actually carry out this goal. And so our reporter looked at everything from the lack of technical training in high schools and community college to the barriers that young electricians face to get jobs and experience. But she also looked at the pilot programs that are rushing to sort of fix this shortage. How do we build this workforce? So that's sort of an example of what we think of when we think our solutions reporting. We're not just blindly saying, renewable energy, it's amazing. We're saying renewable energy, there's potential, but let's also look at the pitfalls and what the trade-offs are. We're being very cautious about this. That story spurred copycat pieces in the New Yorker and the Washington Post in the weeks after we published it. We take that as sort of the highest credit when we talk about driving the climate conversation. And while we all wish that they had just worked with us originally, we're happy to just have them publish it or write their own versions. As our CEO likes to put it, we aim to be a general interest magazine that just happens to be about climate change. That means making our content accessible and approachable. And some of the ways that we do this are we avoid jargon at all costs. We have diverse sources, aka we're not just talking to scientists and academics and environmentalists, even though we cover an inherently kind of scientific issue. We cover a range of communities. We have a lot of geographic diversity. This one is kind of one of my favorite subtle ways that people are kind of surprised about. We don't hire editors with climate expertise. We want them to serve as sort of the gate for a general audience. Writers, reporters can get really in the weeds with some of these issues, especially when they've been reporting on them for several years. Our editors are able to come in and be like, I don't really actually know what this term means, and I don't think a general interest reader will either. So we need to change the language we use. We need to change the framing. And again, that intersectionality. We believe that climate change impacts everyone in myriad ways, and we aim to report on all of these differences. We think we've been successful. Our articles are read by more than 2 million people every month at grist.org and its platforms. And there are many, many, many more in that number that read our content offsite through our publishing partnerships. 65% of our readers say they've taken the information they've learned at Grist and made changes in their own personal lives, or that it has influenced their decisions in some ways. And as a nonprofit newsroom, our coverage is never behind a paywall. We really don't care where people see our content as long as they're seeing it. We want to reach readers where they're at. So partnerships and syndications are also a key part of our editorial strategy. We do this in 2 different ways. We have these sort of key regular partnerships. This includes everything from being a climate partner for the NPR show Here and Now, in which a Grist reporter appears at least once a week to talk about a story that we've published on our site. Here and Now is distributed to hundreds, if not thousands, of NPR stations across the country. We also have been we're the first single subject nonprofit media group. I know that's kind of a lot of classification, but we're gonna, my dev team likes to talk about it, to work with Captivate. Captivate is the company that essentially programs the television screens in elevators. And so you can read a Grist headline when you're riding to the top of the Empire State Building. And we think that's really cool. All of our content is free for any publication to use. I'm going to just repeat that over and over again because it is critical to what we do as a nonprofit. And Grist stories were republished more than 4,700 times in 2023. That number is even higher this year. And I need to get that number from our partnership director. This includes everything from like Teen Vogue to Time Magazine to Wired, all the way to the Weather Channel and even the conservative news site Breitbart. That one really took us by shock. In the same spirit, when we do big investigations, we don't just make the text of our stories free. We also make our painstakingly gathered data open source as well. This story here, Misplaced Trust, we published this in earlier 2024. It's the first in, I think, what will be a 5-part series. This was done by our Indigenous Affairs team, and it looks at how dozens of major US universities were created and funded using stolen Indigenous lands, and how those universities today still continue to rake in billions of dollars in profit from leasing out that land to extractive industries like fossil fuel drilling and mining. The list goes on. So in addition to that story itself, which was incredible, and I recommend, if people have time to check it out later, we also published all of our data gathered over years and years and years through Freedom of Information Act requests on GitHub. And we created user guides and methodologies so that people would know how to use the data themselves. We also, in addition to that, hosted training sessions for journalists and academics on how to use the data in their own reporting. And the result is that more than 24 local news outlets have used our data to do their own local stories on this issue. We're really proud of that. So, as we like to repeat at Grist over and over and over again in our fundraising efforts, none of this work would be possible without our readers. And so now that you have a sense of how Grist operates and our values and our editorial strategy, I want to give you a look at how we harness all of this journalism to generate financial support and sustainability. Because we all want to know how to survive right now. So this first slide here is a breakdown of Grist's financial model. We are a fully diversified organization. I cannot stress this enough. We have 60% of our funding comes from major donors. That, I think, is anyone over $5,000. We have 1/3 from foundations, 4% from earned incomes, ads, the very, very, very occasional sponsored posts. We're very careful about our sponsored posts. We don't do them very often. If I had my ways, we wouldn't do them at all. And 4% of membership are small donors. I'm going to repeat this again. Diversify. Every major nonprofit news organization that I've seen fold in the last 5 years is because they were reliant on only like one major donor. And then that donor had sort of a change of heart or a change in funding strategy, and they just shabam, like the publication was gone in a matter of weeks. Next, when you're a publication in dire financial straits, which I've worked at several, it's really easy to worry about funding first and content later. But at Grist, we've always believed that the reverse is critical. Our funding allows us to do the work that we already wanted to do in the first place. The way that we do this is that we are constantly looking forward. Where do we want to expand? What projects or issues do our reporters want to cover? We think a year, 2 years, 5 years ahead about where the industry is going, what the environment, how the sort of climate environmental issues are changing. And once we have these strategies, we create a pitch, And we just constantly keep our ear to the ground. And then you've sort of created this sort of where you want to go, and that gives us the opportunity to say like, oh, suddenly we're realizing somebody's talking about, I'll get into this in the next slide, but, oh, actually this slide. Oh, a lot of people are suddenly really interested in food and ag. Like we already have a pitch for that. We know exactly how we want to handle this, and we're able to dive in and really tap into those resources very early. So there's a few examples of programs at Grist that I think really exemplify this strategy. In 2021, Grist launched, I believe is the first environmentally focused Indigenous affairs desk in the United States. For us, this was an area that we knew we wanted to expand into. Our focus on environmental justice overlapped here significantly. And we were seeing that we were missing significant stories about land use, displacement, energy policy, because we didn't have the expertise on staff. So at the same time, we were also seeing, so we knew this. We already had sort of a strategy of how are we going to do this. We started reaching out to journalists that we thought could help us fill this desk. We created what we thought, and then that kind of plan just sat there for a little bit, right? As we sort of waited and kept our ear to the ground. And then we started to see this uptick in foundation interest in funding IA reporting. And we felt really confident that we could find a philanthropic fit. So we brought out our detailed proposals to several funders. We hired veteran reporter Tristan Atone as our editor-at-large and gave him almost free rein to conduct his own investigative journalism and also to build Grist's IA desk from the ground up. And that has been an incredibly successful project for us. More recently, last year, we launched a food and agriculture desk. It's the United States' first food and ag desk focused exclusively on climate change. And the beginning of that editorial initiative was actually the sudden closure of this publication called The Counter. I don't know if folks are familiar with it at all, but it was another nonprofit news organization that covered food and agriculture. And as I was mentioning earlier, it essentially had one or two major funders. And the publisher, which, they were the person that were sort of they were the connection to all the funders. The publisher just went, I think I want to do something else. And within a matter of weeks, the publication was gone and all the staff were out of jobs. And The Counter came to us originally to see if Grist would host its archives so that they wouldn't just disappear entirely. This was something that we had done previously for a publication called Pacific Standard, when again, something very similar happened. It had one major funder, that funder had a change of heart, and then the whole publication fell apart. But we had already been talking for a long time within Grist about wanting to cover food and ag. It had been sort of become clear for several years that food was a really critical yet subtle way that people were starting to feel the impacts of climate change. There have been many, many post-election analyses in the United States about why Trump won. And one of the main sort of takeaways is that the economy, and particularly inflation and rising costs for things like groceries, was the sort of determining factor. That's what voters took into the ballot box. And there are major connections here with climate change and those rising prices. So, we know that worsening extreme weather is destroying crops, decreasing yields, and causing food prices to spike. We know that rising temperatures are making it risky for agricultural laborers to work safely. Farmers are having to adjust, what they plant and what they raise in response to shifting pests and growing conditions. And crop insurance in the United States, which is like the financial thing that underpins this whole system, is on the brink of collapse. And so, meanwhile, there's also new industries for things like alternative proteins. Like the way we eat is changing dramatically. I mean, when you go to order coffee in the morning, how many people get whole milk anymore? So we knew that food and ag was an issue that we wanted to cover. We knew that we wanted to help save the counter, and it allowed us to protect the archives, but also gave us a foothold in this space. And so we also knew that there were funders, a coalition of foundations, but also major donors that were really passionate about food and ag. And we knew that they were eager to support this type of work. And so this was an area that we already knew that we wanted to get into. And we just sort of timed it right at a time when funders were really eager to support this type of work. I want to talk about our local news initiative. This has been a major area of growth for us in the last couple of years. So since 2005, the US has lost 2/3 of its newspaper journalists and thousands of local news sources. And I know that this is happening in a lot of places, including Canada as well. We know that this loss of newspapers and this loss of sort of reader loyalty has helped to, one, erode the public trust in journalism, and two, created these massive news deserts that have allowed misinformation and disinformation to take root. If we wanted to cover how climate change is impacting everyone, we knew we had to be everywhere. The sort of first phase in us trying to do this was becoming, for many, many years, Grist had our home base in Seattle. We had an office there. Everybody had to work out of Seattle. And starting even before the pandemic, actually, I think starting in like 2018, we started to hire people across the country and let them live and work where they wanted to. So that was sort of the first, I guess, move towards being able to be, as a national publication, be more representative of the nation we were covering. This was phase two. And we also saw the writing on the philanthropic wall, let's say. We knew that major donors and foundations were really eager to try and rebuild local news, especially after Trump's election in 2016, when everybody kind of sat around and said, oh my God, what happened? We don't know our country. Yes, because we didn't have news in a lot of those communities. And I believe that the Canadian government has announced a similar fund earlier this year to support local news. So we started putting together a proposal for a local news initiative in which we would embed Grist climate reporters into local newsrooms. They are technically Grist employees, but they work 100% of their time out of the local news desk. So we currently have Grist reporters embedded into NPR stations, National Public Radio stations in Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Chicago, and we recently launched, I'm realizing this map is a little bit out of date, but we recently launched our first non-radio local news partnership in New Orleans, Louisiana. And these reporters, sort of the benefit here is that they diversify where and how we are covering climate change as a national newsroom. They're increasing local news ability to write about climate change, to cover climate change. And we're able to reach and engage in ideologically diverse audiences that might otherwise never come to grist.org. And we're okay with that. The way that this model works, we created broad syndication networks for each location. So essentially, these reporters they're a Grist reporter. They spend their entire time working within that local newsroom, and they write just stories. They have editors in their local newsrooms that give them assignments. They write for their local audience, and then we create this network so that when they publish something, like this example is from Georgia, they publish something on Georgia. So there's this one story that there's big climate money out there for small towns, but will they get it? We have an email list of all the partners. So before we even set up these partnerships, our partnership director reaches out to all of these different publications across the state of Georgia and also just regionally, and they say, hey, are you interested in republishing our climate content that this reporter is doing? They sign up, they said, yes, put me on your list. Every single time that Emily Jones, our reporter in Georgia, writes a story, we send out an alert to all of these syndication partners and we say, here's the story, run it if you want. This story got picked up by all of these publications here. So everything like the Morgan Citizen, the Jackson Progress Argus, the Current, the Cherokee Tribune and Ledger News, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. These really range from like some of the biggest publications in these states, like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, to the teeny tiny local, hyper-local news sites. Because this Emily Jones actually works for WABE, the local Georgia NPR affiliate, that story got picked up by NPR's All Things Considered. It got nationalized, which then went out through all of its, across the country. And then we also, 1,000 radio stations, that NPR version. And then we also published the article on Grist.org, and it went through all of our national syndication networks. And so you had one story that got picked up by 50 partner outlets and 1,000 radio stations. So we really see this as a highly effective model for being able to be a national publication but still have an impact at a local level. It allowed us to do the type of work we already wanted to do anyway, and it allowed us to tap into a diverse funding stream. So when we set up these local partnerships, we approach local donors, people that care about their community, that care about their state, whether or not that they care about local news in their community or they care about climate change in their community. So we're able to kind of tap into both the issue-specific donors and the news-specific donors. And we're also able to tap into the sort of national funders that want to rebuild local news in the United States. So I think this is really exciting. I imagine you all will have a lot of questions about this, but I have a couple more examples because so far we've been talking about these really big funding endeavors, right? Full-time staff, major editorial strategies, but Grist also experiments with reporting projects that had sort of the side benefit of helping to support membership and audience efforts. And my first year at Grist, this is a little bit of like a labor of love for me. This launched the first year I was here. And we created something that is known internally as the Extremes Project. I was looking for because we have staff all over the country, we have staff that cover all these different beats, I was looking for a project that was going to be a real team building exercise for our newsroom. Pick a single subject and everybody can get involved in covering it, right? How can we do this to create this feeling of collaboration and camaraderie? And we decided that every single summer, at the height of extreme weather season, we were going to pick a different type of extreme weather to focus on. And that every reporter was going to look at that extreme weather through the lens of their beat. So the first year that we did this, we did the intersection of climate and wildfires and like all of our reporters' beats. So, we had, for example, we had like our science reporters looking at like the uptick of wildfires. We had our solutions reporters looking at, all the innovative ways to try to like, are there preventative burning activities? Are there new, like, what do we do with all of the dead biomass that's on the ground as a result of rising temperatures and worsening pest infestations? And since that first year, we have since done a summer in which we focused on drought, a summer in which we focused on extreme heat, and this year, we looked at how extreme weather broadly is impacting elections. And we did, this was sort of our nod to it's a major election year in the US. This project, we do in-depth features and investigations. It also allows us to do sort of like daily and weekly reporting through the lens of wildfires or drought or whatever it is. And we quickly realized that the project could do more than just help the newsroom do really great, innovative reporting. It could also help us bring in more loyal readers, grow our newsletter lists, and serve as a fundraising initiative for our members or our small donors. Now in year 4, the project, I've only included 3, forgive me, but now in year 4, the project includes a limited run newsletter, usually 12 weeks, that brings thousands of new newsletter subscribers into the Grist ecosystem. These are people who otherwise are like, maybe I don't want to follow the entire Grist content, right? But I am interested in this particular issue because it's an issue that affects my community. And so we've also seen a lot of like regional diversity. When we did the wildfire project and we had the wildfire newsletter, like the amount of new subscribers we got in the Western United States was crazy. Similar with drought, elections this year was just all over the place. Extreme heat, we saw a huge uptick in subscribers in sort of the southwestern United States. And as soon as the newsletter is done, our audience team immediately goes into mode of, hey, you've been reading us for the last 12 weeks. This has been great content. Come join us for the rest of our stuff, right? Come. We don't automatically add anybody to our newsletters. Of course, you can't do that, but we do everything we can to like bring them over to the rest of Grist. We also work with our membership director to run like an off-season fundraising campaign to support the project, right? So everybody kind of knows that like the major time of year for nonprofit fundraising is the end of the calendar year. We found that with this project running in summer, we were able to engage and motivate donors at odd times of the year who had a particular interest in, a subject-based reporting project, rather than like the broad calls for core funding that tends to come at the end of the calendar year. We also sometimes find sponsors for the series, though we vet them very, very closely. So for our drought and extreme heat packages, we had Fat Tire Brewing, which is a beer brewing company, was for our drought package. That was perfect because they had concerns over water, and they don't have any role in what they just like slap their logo on the newsletter and the main series page, and they're good to go. And then for the extreme heat package, we had the Wilderness Society. But since this year's package centered on covering elections, we actually chose to forego a sponsor this year. That was a deliberate decision. And I think what's been really interesting here is that we also, talking about sort of the off-season fundraising, we're able to send out to our readers, hey, like we're covering this issue. This is something, we'd really love your support. It also gave us an opportunity to tap a major donor because we could go to a major donor and say, we're running this package, we're trying to drive, small donors to come in and support it, but will you be our match? Will you be our match so that we can convince, we can say to all of our readers, support or pay, donate $10, it becomes $20. Donate $50, it becomes $100. And that also allowed us to tap into a major donor as sort of like an entry step into the Grist ecosystem as well. And then speaking of membership, I think there can often be this feeling that news organizations, development teams need to work in a vacuum in order to maintain a publication's editorial independence. And I wholeheartedly believe that and also slightly disagree with it at the same time. I serve as a little bit of a firewall between our edit team and our donors. Our edit team, our reporters, our editors do not meet with funders. I meet with funders. Our reporters and editors do not know what grant agreements we have. I mean, they're listed. Like, we have to, obviously, for transparency, we list who our funders are on our website. But they don't know the details of the grant agreements, right? Like, and I don't want them to, because I want them to just do their best work. That's the only thing I care about. But when it comes to membership appeals, this is the one area that I'm like, okay. Because specifically our end of the year campaign, our like tax time campaign in the United States, April, our newsroom actually works closely with our membership director, our small donor director, because she and I meet at the beginning of every campaign and we lay out the roadmap for the entire campaign. I review all of the major projects that we have coming up in the next month or however long the campaign is going to be. And I flag for her, like, hey, we're publishing this really big investigation on, let's say, March 15th. It would be really cool to send a donor appeal March 17th to say, like, hey, that work that we just did, that was because you support us. We are able to do that work because you support us. And she times her donor appeals to coincide with these sort of major publication dates in order for like a maximum punch. And our reporters actually will work with her to pen those emails. Sometimes she takes a first stab at it and they like edit it and rip it apart and do their own thing. Sometimes they write it, they want to write it the first time. But this means that we think it's important for transparency, for engagement, that our readers get to know our staff and the issues that they're reporting on. And so rather than the Grist donor emails coming from like the same 4 leaders in the organization, it would be very ineffective for me to send out 5 donor emails, my CEO to send out X number. They come from across the organization. And so our reporters, everything from like our reporters have written these, our community engagement director have written these, but they do this only at certain times of the year and with certain membership drives. And if anybody is uncomfortable, they do not participate. But I think most of our reporters, they want our readers to know what they're covering. They want to know that people, they want to feel connected to our audience, and this is one of the ways they can do this. We've seen real success in this model. Our number of small donors has grown steadily for years, and our rate of sustaining donors, those who give every month, has shot through the roof, surprisingly. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that. But last but not least, I have sort of a bits and bobs, like et cetera was a nice way to time. But, I've mentioned this before many, many times during this presentation, but like our editorial priorities do not drive our fundraising efforts. Our editorial priorities do drive our fundraising efforts, not the other way around. Make sure you have a board or advisors that are innovative, supportive, and willing to make connections for you. Make sure that they are serving your organization and that it is not just a relationship in which they get to put they're on the board of directors. Make sure it is a relationship that is mutually beneficial. Grow sustainbly. At Grist, we have grown. We just hit the $10 million mark as an organization. But we do not hire for a new position unless we know we have funding for several years for that position. I think our standard is usually 3 years. We do not hire for short-term contracts. We do not say, oh, look, we have a year of funding. When we hire, we make real investments in people, and we want to make sure that we are there for the long haul. If you are just starting or you've recently launched, hire a development person early. It can often feel like, well, we have to build our newsroom before we hire a development person. I actually think it should be the other way around. I think I've seen a lot of success at publications where like the second or third hire is somebody to manage their development. And I think that's the way to go. Because when you are asking your newsroom leadership to be the sole funder or the sole sort of funder relationship manager. And I worked for a publication where me and my executive editor, we were the ones writing grant proposals, making connections, writing the grants, reports, the mid-grant reports and the end of grant reports, and trying to maintain these relationships. It meant that we had less time to do the editorial work and the journalism that we wanted to do. And so I do think that there needs to be a little bit of a divide and a respect for the different skill sets. And I think there's often this feeling like, well, I can do that. Tapping into funding is like, it's a whole other world. And I love our development team. They're amazing. So thank you for listening. I know that this probably felt like a lot. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm really looking forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Kat, for joining us today, coming all the way from the East Coast. My name is Doris Byrne. If we haven't met before, I'm a publisher and a learning content producer. I'm a publisher and learning content producer, and I worked with Magazines BC on developing the program for the conference today. So I had early contact with Kat, and I particularly wanted to bring somebody from Grist in to speak with us because not only is Vancouver, British Columbia really sits at the epicenter of climate change and is a locus as well for climate change journalism. And everywhere I go in Canada, I hear other journalists in other kinds of media, whether they're in lifestyle media or food media, say, climate change is one of those things that we really want to incorporate into our editorial mandate. We want to make sure that we're using that intersectionality in the coverage that we do, but we don't always know how to talk to our audience about it. We feel like sometimes we're stepping wrong. Like you're either talking to the people who know that they know about it and they're like, yes, thank you for mentioning the environment when we close our cottage, and then there are others who do not want to hear it.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I wanted to explore with you, while maybe the audience comes up with their additional questions, is how do you think other kinds of media can start incorporating that into the way they talk to their audiences? Mm-hmm.
I think that there's this feeling that if you're going to write a climate change article, and I sort of get to this, that it has to be predominantly about climate change, right? And I think that there's a way to just say, this is the subject that I cover, and there happens to be, this, as I was talking about in the presentation, this sort of right? And so there's an example that I had of, there was, in Florida, we did this big investigation into heat protection bills in Florida, right? In which you had bills that were trying to pass the Florida House in order to protect outdoor laborers from extreme heat. And that failed over and over and over and over again. And then you had, we sort of did the narrative of the story where we compared it to, there was a student athlete that died in Florida from a white, wealthy community in Florida. And within 6 months, the state had passed this student protection bill for student athletes, protecting them from extreme heat and making sure that high school teams had access to, they had the whole sort of system set up to deal with extreme heat, and that the teams couldn't practice outside if heat was above a certain amount. We did not necessarily make that story about climate change. We made that story about ag and student athletes. And so, for example, if I were writing a story about student athletes dealing with more extreme heat, I wouldn't necessarily write, as global temperatures climb, student athletes are dealing with, worsening heat risk, health risks. I would just say, student athletes are dealing with worsening health risks. And so I think there's a way of framing everything from the story to how you present your headlines. And so, yeah.
Who writes the fundraising letters and then who signs off on them? Who puts their signature on them?
It depends on the reporter. Some reporters prefer to write it first. and then they send it to our membership director, who works with them to sort of edit it to add the donor language, right? The give now and all of that. But there are some reporters that are like, I want this to be in my voice. I want this. I want to take ownership of this. And then there are other reporters that are just like, I have an insane week. I am happy to send this email out, but can you take a first stab at it, and then I'll edit it and I'll make changes to it to like make it more in my voice and everything. And so I think it goes both ways depending on, but it is really a collaboration. Like our reporter learns a lot from our development team, and then our development team really, they are able to lean on our reporters for their expertise on the subjects, right? Like there was a story, and then also all of these emails, all these letters, I review every single one of them as well. And so there was one that we sent out a couple of days ago, for example, because we're sort of in that end of the year campaign, in which it was about our reporting on plastics. And we had just published a scoop in which the White House had promised several months ago. They brought all of these like environmental groups in and said, we're with you. We are going to support a sort of deadline to ramp down plastic production. And then this past week, they brought those same people in and they said, actually, we've decided we don't want to do that. And we broke that story. And we had written the donor appeal before that story got published. And so I was able to go in on like the day before it went out and be like, we need to insert this story that we just did to make that connection between what we published on the site and what these folks may have just seen with this letter that they're getting. So it really is a collaboration, and sometimes it depends on workflows, sometimes it depends on people's personalities and like what they prefer in terms of membership, but yeah, it's not a black and white.
I had a question about the syndicating the stories. So we have a small local magazine and we have climate articles related to our own community, but sometimes we want to give the bigger picture. And because I guess most of your stuff is US based, mm-hmm. if we found something that paired, would we have to contact someone for permission to reprint, or how does that work for syndicating the story?
We ask, so we have on our website, we have our sort of syndication guidelines printed. We ask that people let us know, just out of courtesy, so we can kind of keep track of impact and where our stories are going. But I don't believe you have to ask first.
With your syndicate partners, how do you track when the story is taken, even farther? How do you sort of track the reach beyond your syndication partners if somebody takes it and runs with it?
Generally, that doesn't happen. Generally, they would come back to the original site, because one of our requirements is that at the top, if you're going to syndicate our story, at the top of the story, you have to say where it's from. And so, I mean, maybe that's happened, but we don't make a big deal out of it. There's a couple of websites that like to just pull all of our content, right? And I don't think they've asked for permission, but that's fine. But yeah, at the top of every single time a story is syndicated, it says this story originally appeared on Grist. And then I think we also have a note. I think it's, to subscribe to Grist newsletter and with like a link back to us. And that's a requirement that we have.
You mentioned that your content is provided free to the syndication partners, which is different, I guess, than republishing, in which case you'd want your writer to be compensated. So are you focused on the content that staff have written, or is it any of the content, including freelance content?
We have in our freelance contract, so we don't publish a lot of freelance, but we do publish freelance. I would say it's probably like maybe a 90-10 breakdown. But we have in our freelance contract that we have the, we hold the rights to the story for, I think it's 60 days, in which point we can distribute it like through our syndication networks and everything. That's spelled out in our freelance contract. But if a publication wants to republish after those 60 days, the rights are back to the writer. And so they have to contact the writer and get permission. And I do think that's pretty rare. Most freelance contracts, I think, are either we hold the rights in perpetuity, or we hold it for at least a year. But we feel, I started my career as a freelancer, and I feel very strongly that freelancers should have ownership over the work that they've created. We've created that 60-day buffer just to allow us for this sort of syndication network and strategy that we have. But we've also had times where a freelancer's story, somebody's come to them and say, hey, we want to buy the rights to the story to convert it into like a podcast or a documentary or whatever. And we're like, gee whiz, that's really wonderful. Go to the writer. Like, that's who you should be paying. They're the ones that did that work.
I thought it was really interesting, this idea of kind of how climate used to be a more sciencey story, and now there's really this shift toward thinking of justice and all these other intersectional aspects. And I am wondering how intentional it is to also move away from thinking about it as a science story at all. Like, I'm guessing there's no climate plus science.
We do have that.
Okay.
We do have that on the
How do you
website.
communicate how do you communicate it as a science story in a way that helps with the communication strategy?
Yeah, we've done there's sort of two ways to think of it. There's the one that's just like, what is the latest climate science saying? So, what is Nature and Science and sort of all the big scientific journals talking about, and like, what are the sort of the latest breakthroughs in our understanding of climate change? And we cover those, right? Like, we do write those stories. I think one of the biggest changes is that used to be all people used to write about. And so we actually don't have a reporter who only focuses on science. We have one of our solutions reporters, Matt Simon, who we recently poached from Wired. He did a lot of the climate science reporting for Wired. And so he kind of does double duty for us in doing a lot of the solutions reporting. But then he also is just like a science nerd in that he just like geeks out over all the latest research. So he'll write that stuff. So, but we don't cover, our sort of bar for covering that is pretty high. We want to make sure that if we're writing about a study or the latest advancements, it has to really represent a change or be this sort of like, have a lot of big impact. So like, I think an example of that would be the latest on the understanding of how climate change is slowing the ocean circulation system, right? Like that has massive, massive impacts. But we wouldn't necessarily report every single new science on like how fast Greenland is melting. And then the other way that we cover it is we cover the scientific community itself. And so we did a profile of a scientist that I'm going to remember as soon as I step down from up here, that was looking at, he had published his research and then actually criticized it himself like a month or two later and was like, I don't know if this is the best way. And I know that there's a lot of debate right now within the scientific community over, do we be optimistic that we can do this, or do we just immediately go to like the worst case scenarios and like terrify everybody? Like, what is the most effective sort of research direction and communication direction? And this scientist was really torn between the two. And we did this really, our reporter Kate Yoder did this amazing profile of this scientist and this like dilemma that he was facing. And so we'll also cover it that way, like what's happening within the scientific community.